The house on Hollow Street had been empty for 10 years. No one had gone inside. No one, except for one person. Detective Jack Carter drummed his fingers on his desk, staring at the latest bank statement from an account that should have been dormant for a decade. Sarah Miller's disappearance had been one of those cases that haunted the local police department, a 23-year-old woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a grieving family and a stack of unanswered questions. Now, after 10 years of silence, her credit card had suddenly sprung to life at Walker's Corner store, just 3 blocks from where she was last seen. The security footage from the store had been frustratingly inconclusive. The camera angle was poor, the lighting worse, and the figure who used the card kept their face hidden beneath a hood. But Tom Walker, the store's owner for the past 30 years, swore up and down that he'd seen her clearly, a young woman with flowing red hair, looking exactly as she had in the missing person posters that once plastered the town streets. She didn't age a day, Tom had insisted, his weathered hands trembling as he poured himself another cup of coffee. It was like looking at a ghost. Jack knew better than to trust ghost stories, but something about this case made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been a private investigator for 15 years, handling everything from cheating spouses to corporate fraud. The Miller case wasn't even his officially, the police had long since classified it as a cold case. But Sarah's parents had never stopped searching, and when they'd shown up at his office with the bank statement in hand, he couldn't turn them away. The autumn wind whistled through the trees as Jack pulled his car up to the curb on Hollow Street. The house loomed before him, a Victorian relic with peeling gray paint and shutters that hung askew like broken wings. The property records showed it had been abandoned since around the time Sarah disappeared, caught in a legal limbo after the previous owner's death. Jack checked his watch, 4:47 p.m. The sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. He pulled out his flashlight and phone, making sure both were fully charged. Years of experience had taught him never to enter an abandoned building without backup power sources. The front gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet street. Dead leaves crunched under his feet as he made his way up the weed-choked path to the front door. The porch boards groaned beneath his weight, and he noticed something odd. Despite the decade of abandonment, there was a clear path through the dust on the porch, as if someone had been walking here regularly. The door was slightly ajar, another detail that set off warning bells in his mind. He'd expected to need his lock-picking kit, but someone had beaten him to it. Drawing his flashlight, Jack pushed the door open wider, wincing at the prolonged creak of rusted hinges. The smell hit him first, a musty combination of rotting wood, mold, and something else he couldn't quite identify. A metallic tang that reminded him of old pennies. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a grand foyer that had long since lost its grandeur. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, revealing the dark wood beneath. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by years of dust and cobwebs. Jack's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he moved deeper into the house. Despite the decay, there was something almost preserved about the place, as if it had been sealed in amber at the moment of its abandonment. Family photos still hung on the walls, their faces obscured by grime. A coat rack stood by the door, holding a single woman's jacket that seemed oddly free of dust. He reached out to touch the jacket, but a sudden crash from upstairs made him freeze. The sound of breaking glass, followed by what could have been footsteps, or perhaps just the settling of an old house. Jack's hand instinctively went to the small of his back where he kept his licensed concealed weapon, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "My name is Jack Carter. I'm a private investigator." Only silence answered him, but it was a strange kind of silence, thick and watchful, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The beam of his flashlight caught movement at the top of the stairs, but when he snapped his head up to look, there was nothing there. Just shadows playing tricks on his eyes. The stairs looked solid enough, though each step prompted a protest of aged wood. As he ascended, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd been in plenty of abandoned buildings during investigations, but something about this place felt different. Wrong, somehow. The second floor was a long hallway with doors on either side, all closed except for one at the far end. Light spilled from that room, actual electric light, not just the beam of his flashlight. Jack checked his phone, still full signal, but the screen showed the temperature had dropped several degrees since he'd entered the house. "If anyone's here, I'm not looking for trouble," he announced, moving slowly toward the lit room. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Sarah Miller. I just want to ask some questions." A soft laugh echoed through the hallway, definitely a woman's laugh, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jack felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations: squatters, teenagers playing pranks, his own imagination working overtime in the growing darkness. The lit room turned out to be what had once been a bedroom. A vanity table stood against one wall, its mirror reflecting the warm glow of an old lamp that somehow still worked. The bed was made with faded floral sheets, and a book lay open on the nightstand as if someone had just stepped away from reading it. Jack approached the vanity, noting that unlike everything else in the house, its surface was clean. No dust. No cobwebs. Just a hairbrush with a few strands of red hair caught in its bristles. His breath caught in his throat as he picked up the brush. The hairs were fresh, not brittle or faded with age. Recent. Real. A floorboard creaked behind him. Jack spun around, nearly dropping the brush. The doorway was empty, but the temperature in the room had dropped so dramatically he could see his breath misting in the air. The lamp on the vanity flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Movement caught his eye in the vanity mirror. For a split second, he saw a figure standing behind him, a young woman with long red hair wearing a white dress. But when he turned again, he was still alone in the room. His heart hammered against his ribs as he looked back at the mirror. This time, his own reflection stared back at him, pale and tense in the dim light. A phone buzzed, making him jump. It wasn't his phone, the sound came from the nightstand drawer. With cautious steps, Jack approached and pulled it open. Inside lay a smartphone in a pink case, its screen lighting up with an incoming text message. The phone was an older model, but not 10 years old. Maybe 3 or 4 years, at most. The message preview showed on the lock screen, "You shouldn't have let him in." Jack's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. The wallpaper was a selfie of a young woman with red hair, Sarah Miller, looking exactly as she had in her missing person photos. The timestamp on the photo read, "Today, 4:52 p.m. "This is impossible," he muttered, his detective's mind racing to find a rational explanation. Someone must be playing an elaborate hoax. But why? And how had they known he was coming? The phone buzzed again in his hand. "Look in the closet, Jack." He nearly dropped the device. How did they know his name? He hadn't told anyone he was investigating this case except Sarah's parents and Tom Walker at the store. The message shouldn't even be appearing on a locked phone. Common sense told him to leave, to come back in daylight with backup. But he'd spent 15 years following his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that he was close to something important. Jack tucked the phone into his pocket and moved to the closet door, drawing his gun before reaching for the handle. The door swung open with surprising ease. The closet was a walk-in, larger than he'd expected. His flashlight beam revealed rows of hanging clothes, all women's dresses and coats. At the back, a full-length mirror reflected his image, distorted slightly by a crack that ran diagonally across its surface. But it wasn't the mirror that made his blood run cold. It was the wall beside it, covered in photographs. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. Each showed Sarah Miller going about her daily life, getting coffee, walking down streets, sitting in parks. The photos spanned different seasons, different times of day. Some looked decades old, while others appeared recent, showing modern cars and storefronts in the background. In every single photo, Sarah looked exactly the same age. The sound of a door slamming somewhere in the house jolted Jack from his stunned observation. He whirled around, gun raised, but the bedroom behind him was empty. The lamp on the vanity had gone out, leaving him in the beam of his flashlight. As he stepped out of the closet, a newspaper clipping on the vanity caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed before. The headline read, "Missing Woman's Body Found in River." The article was dated just 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, but the body had been too decomposed for positive identification. The police had suspected it was Sarah, but without conclusive DNA evidence, the case had remained open. Jack's mind raced. If Sarah had died 10 years ago, who was using her credit card? Who was taking these photos? And why did they all show her unchanged, eternally 23? The phone in his pocket buzzed again. Against his better judgment, he looked at the screen. "Now you know too much." The bedroom door slammed shut. Jack rushed to it, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature plunged further, his breath coming out in thick white clouds. Behind him, the lamp on the vanity flickered back to life, casting wild shadows on the walls. "Who's there?" he demanded, spinning around with his gun and flashlight cutting through the dimness. "Show yourself. You're a good detective, Jack." The voice came from behind him, soft and feminine. "Better than the others. They never made it this far." He turned slowly. A young woman stood by the vanity, Sarah Miller, exactly as she appeared in the photos. Her red hair seemed to float slightly, as if suspended in water. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the lamplight. "You're not real," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "You can't be." Sarah, or whatever wore her face, smiled sadly. "Reality is more complicated than you think, detective. Sometimes the truth is buried so deep that digging it up only causes more pain." "What happened to you?" Jack kept his gun trained on her, though some part of him knew it would be useless. "I died in this house," she said simply. "But I didn't leave. I couldn't. He wouldn't let me." "He? Who's he?" Sarah's form flickered like a bad television signal. "The same man who killed me. The same man who's been watching you since you entered the house. The same man who's standing right behind you." Jack spun around, but strong hands were already wrapping around his throat. He caught a glimpse of a face he recognized, Tom Walker, the store owner, but younger, stronger than the man he'd interviewed. The gun clattered from Jack's grasp as he struggled against the iron grip. "You should have left it alone," Walker growled, his voice deeper, different from the trembling store owner Jack had interviewed. "Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved." Jack drove his elbow backward, connecting with Walker's ribs. The grip loosened enough for him to break free, but as he stumbled forward, his foot caught on the edge of an ornate rug. He went down hard, his flashlight spinning away across the floor, casting wild shadows that made the room seem to writhe with movement. Walker's boot came down on Jack's back, pinning him to the floor. 10 years I've kept this secret," he snarled. 10 years of watching, making sure no one got too close. The others were easy to scare away. But you're persistent. Like she was. Through the pain and pressure, Jack's detective mind was still working, piecing together the puzzle. "The store, you bought it right after she disappeared. You've been using it to monitor anyone who came looking for her." "Smart man." Walker increased the pressure. "Too smart. You know what happens to smart people. They end up like Sarah. Too many questions. Too much curiosity." The temperature in the room dropped even further. The lamp on the vanity exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness except for the beam of the fallen flashlight. In that moment, Jack felt the pressure on his back vanish as Walker was thrown backward with a startled cry. Sarah's ghostly form stood between them, her hair and dress moving in an unfelt wind. "Not this time, Tom," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "You've haunted this house long enough." Walker scrambled to his feet, his younger appearance flickering like a bad hologram, revealing moments of his true aged self. "You're dead," he spat. "I killed you." "You can't." "Yes, you killed me," Sarah's spirit advanced on him. "After I discovered what you really were. After I threatened to expose your secret. A respected business owner who'd been preying on young women for decades, using this house to hide your victims. But you didn't expect me to stay, did you? You didn't expect me to become stronger than you." Jack had managed to retrieve his gun, though he wasn't sure it would do any good against whatever was happening. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie light, and shadows moved with purpose around the edges of the room. "How many others?" Jack demanded, keeping his weapon trained on Walker. "How many before Sarah?" Walker's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You'll never prove anything. A ghost's testimony won't hold up in court, detective. And who's going to believe your story about what happened here tonight?" "I'll believe it." A new voice came from the doorway. Jack turned to see an older woman standing there, holding up a phone that was clearly recording. Her hands shook, but her grip was steady enough. "I'm Margaret Miller, Sarah's mother. And I've been waiting 10 years to hear this confession." Walker's face contorted with rage. He lunged toward Margaret, but Sarah's spirit flared with brilliant light, forcing him back. The walls trembled, and decades-old photographs began falling from their pins, scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. "Mom," Sarah's voice was softer now, filled with a decade of unspoken words. "I tried to reach you. All these years, I tried." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret's voice cracked. "The dreams. Every night for 10 years, I dreamed you were trying to tell me something. That's why I hired Jack. That's why I've been watching the store, waiting for him to make a mistake." Walker backed toward the window, his appearance shifting rapidly between young and old, like a corrupted digital image. "You can't prove anything. A ghost, a grieving mother, and a detective who breaks into abandoned houses? Who's going to believe any of this?" "The police might be interested in what's under the floorboards," Sarah said. "In the basement. All those missing women over the years, Tom. Did you think their spirits were just gone? We've been waiting. Watching. Growing stronger." As if in response to her words, more translucent figures began to materialize around the room, women of different ages, from different decades, all bearing the same haunted look in their eyes. Walker's face went slack with terror as he recognized each one. "Patricia Collins, 1982, Sarah's voice rang out. "Emily Roberts, 1989. "Michelle Torres, 1995. "We remember our names, Tom. We remember what you did." Jack kept his gun trained on Walker, though the man now seemed more concerned with the closing circle of spirits than the physical threat. "It's over," Jack said. "The police will find the evidence. These women will finally be found. Their families can have closure." A wail of sirens pierced the night. Margaret must have called them before entering the house. Walker's eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for escape. But the spirits drew closer, their combined presence making the air so cold that frost began forming on the windows. "No," Walker's voice cracked. "No, you're not real. None of this is real." He backed up further, pressing against the window glass. The ancient frame creaked ominously. "Tom Walker," Sarah's spirit moved forward, her form growing brighter. "You've lived with your secrets for decades. But secrets have weight. They have consequences." The window frame gave way with a thunderous crack. Walker's eyes went wide as he lost his balance, his arms windmilling in the air. Jack lunged forward to grab him, his detective's instincts still focused on bringing him to justice, but he was too late. Walker's scream echoed through the house as he fell backward through the broken window. There was a terrible moment of silence, followed by a sickening thud. The spirits began to fade one by one, their presence lingering like afterimages in the darkness. Soon only Sarah remained, her form growing fainter by the second. Police lights strobed through the broken window, casting red and blue shadows across the walls. "They won't find him," Sarah said softly. "His body, yes. But the real Tom Walker died years ago, the first time he took a life. What's been walking around all these years, it wasn't entirely human anymore." Margaret stepped forward, her hand reaching out instinctively toward her daughter's fading form. "Sarah, please, don't go. Not again." "I have to, Mom. We all do. But we'll rest now." Finally. Sarah's ghost turned to Jack. "The evidence you need is in the basement. Behind the old furnace, there's a false wall. Everything he kept, every trophy, every record, it's all there. Make sure they find it. Make sure they know who he really was." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "I will. I promise. And Mom?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. "I love you. I never stopped trying to tell you that." Margaret's tears fell freely. "I love you too, baby. I always will." Sarah's form dissolved like mist in morning sunlight, leaving them in the darkness of the old room. Footsteps thundered up the stairs as police officers responded to Margaret's earlier call. Jack quickly holstered his weapon and raised his hands as flashlight beams cut through the doorway. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and careful documentation. The false wall in the basement revealed exactly what Sarah had promised: decades of evidence, carefully preserved. Walker's body was found on the overgrown lawn, though the medical examiner would later note inconsistencies they couldn't explain: tissue samples that seemed decades old, cellular structures that defied normal biology. 3 months later, Jack sat in his office, reviewing the final police report. The case had made national headlines: serial killer's decades-long spree ends in historic house. The official version was more mundane than the truth: a confrontation with a private investigator, a confession recorded on a grieving mother's phone, a fatal fall while trying to escape. The supernatural elements were relegated to local ghost stories and late-night podcasts. The house on Hollow Street was scheduled for demolition, but construction crews reported equipment failures every time they attempted to begin work. The basement had been carefully excavated, giving closure to dozens of families whose loved ones had vanished over the years. But the upper floors remained untouched, and at night, locals swore they could see lights moving from window to window. Jack picked up the last piece of evidence from his desk: Sarah's phone, now cleaned and catalogued. The screen lit up one final time, showing a single message: "Thank you for hearing our stories. Some mysteries are meant to be solved." The phone went dark and would never turn on again. 6 months after the events at the house, Jack still found himself drawn back to Hollow Street. The demolition company had finally given up, leaving the old Victorian to its secrets. Nature was slowly reclaiming the property, vines crawling up the walls, wildflowers pushing through cracks in the walkway. Sometimes he'd park across the street and watch as the sun set, casting long shadows through the broken windows. Margaret Miller had moved away, finding peace in a small coastal town where she could walk on the beach and feel close to her daughter. She'd called Jack once to tell him about a dream: Sarah standing in the surf at sunrise, smiling and whole. It was different this time, Margaret had said. She wasn't trying to tell me anything. She was just happy. The investigation had led to the resolution of 47 cold cases spanning 3 decades. Tom Walker's secret room had contained detailed records, dates, locations, photographs, personal effects. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was still trying to understand how he'd operated undetected for so long. Their preliminary reports suggested he'd chosen his hunting ground carefully: a small town where people knew each other, where his position as a store owner made him both trusted and invisible. But there were details that would never make it into the official reports. The medical examiner's notes about Walker's impossible biology were sealed and classified. The numerous equipment malfunctions at the crime scene were attributed to the house's age and electrical issues. The temperature anomalies, the moving lights, the sounds that no recording device could capture, all filed away in that vast bureaucratic category of unexplained phenomena. Jack had received other cases since then, but none quite like this one. His reputation had grown, people sought him out when conventional investigations hit dead ends. Some called him lucky. Others said he had a sixth sense for the truth. Only he knew that sometimes the truth itself was fluid, changing shape in the shadows between what was possible and what was real. Late one evening, almost a year to the day after Sarah's case closed, Jack received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, faded and water-damaged, showing a young woman with red hair standing in front of the house on Hollow Street. The date stamp read 1947. She could have been Sarah's twin. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written, "Some houses are born bad. Some houses learn. And some houses remember." Jack filed the photograph away with his private notes on the case, next to the newspaper clipping about the body in the river that had never been definitively identified. Some mysteries, he had learned, weren't meant to be solved completely. They lived in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, between what we can prove and what we can only sense. The house on Hollow Street still stands, its windows dark except on certain nights when the moon is full and the wind blows just right. Locals say they sometimes see a young woman with red hair in the upstairs window, watching over the street like a guardian. They say other figures join her sometimes, shadows of the lost and forgotten, keeping their vigil in that space between justice and vengeance, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Some say the house is waiting. Others say it's protecting. But no one goes inside anymore. No one except, perhaps, those who need to be found.